Now let's wrap up our discussion of religion and science, or science, the Enlightenment, and the religious response. Perhaps that's where we want to be. And we talked last time about the role of Protestant responses to some of these new scientific developments, but also the Catholic Church's response to some of these new developments. Consider, again, from the Catholic Church perspective, that this institution, which has been around for over at the time, almost 2,000 years, has seen developments in European politics, European philosophy, science, mathematics, and is trying to cope with now, as we move into the modern era, the changes that are afoot, not only because of science, but also the technological application of some of science and the philosophical application of the scientific method to the human condition. So political science, economics, social science, and many philosophers suggesting, out of a perspective from skepticism, out of other perspectives, that perhaps religion is not the way to go. Perhaps religion is not the alpha and the omega as we understand religion to be, particularly when it comes to reason, particularly when it comes to philosophy. So the church finds itself in an interesting and challenging position. It's not the first time the church has found itself in such a position, and it certainly won't be the last. So the Kulturkampf takes us to Germany. Last time we talked a little bit about Italy and some of the historical context in which these ideas are playing out. And so we want to go to Germany, and there's this time period in Germany from 1872 to 1887 that's often referred to as the Kulturkampf, or the Culture War. And this coincides with the development of Germany as a state. So just as Italy itself does not become the modern country that it is until the later part of the 19th century, the same with Germany. So German unification happens in the second half of the 19th century. And with that comes a lot of ideas about what it means to be German, what it means to be modern. The king who is leading Germany at the time is Kaiser Wilhelm I, and he is supported by his chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. And they too are dealing with, on a political level and a social level, this idea of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, but also ideas following the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and these ideas of creating a nation state and what that means. One of the images I have here for you is a political cartoon in Germany, and you have this image of the blind traveler on the wagon of progress, right? The blind traveler on the wagon of progress. And so you have this female figure who is Germany, who is the state, being pulled by progress, by these men waving their hats. Progress, let's go to the future. Let's engage in science. Let's engage in technology and all of these things, and all of the ideas that come with it. And behind her, on the rear of the wagon, is this rather ominous-looking figure. It's actually a fox, dressed in the guise of sort of a medieval religious man, clergyman. You can see the rosary that he has, the cross down here. And so he is sort of tagging along, if you will. He is maybe holding back, even weighing down the traveler who is trying to make progress. So we often see in the rhetoric, in the literature of the time period, that that religion is sort of slowing down our work into the future. So as Germany is trying to unify in the 19th century, one of the areas associated with Germany is the region called Prussia. Prussia is sort of the central part of Germany today, if you will, central, northeast, if you will. In 1837, there's something called the Köln or the Cologne confusion. There's this question of mixed marriages, and mixed marriages being between Catholics and non-Catholics. And in this particular case, the church holds marriage as a sacrament. And in the early 19th century, if one wants to marry a Catholic, one must be Catholic. And so the idea that the state will allow civil marriages, right, between people without concern of their religion really raises flags for the church. And in 1837, in Prussia, this one region that will be Germany, the state gives in to the church and says, all right, there are no mixed marriages. You must, if you, Catholics marry Catholics, Protestants marry Protestants. If you want to marry someone of another faith, you must convert. In 1850, there is a dispute with the church in Germany on defining these civil marriages and on primary schools, right? Who ought to be running schools? Well, in Germany, previous to this time period, the Catholic Church provided a lot of services to people in this region for education sake. There is no public education previous to the 19th century as we know it today. So the role of the church in many regions in Europe was to support, provide education in various communities. So in the 19th century, we're starting to see the state want to be more involved in offering education and trying to push the church out. In 1852, we get in Prussia a decree against the Jesuits. And we think that what's going on here is not that necessarily there wasn't a particular political event that led to this, but the Jesuits very much engaged in education, very much insistent that the Jesuits continue to provide public education, if you will, or education to given communities, and the Jesuits are going to find themselves in the losing fight this time. So in 1837, the church gives in to ideas about marriage, but by 1852, the state is pushing Catholic education out. So you can see that the church is starting to feel that in some of these most important areas in a community's life, they're being challenged. Now, Germany west of the Rhine, I have here, Prussia sort of central and northeastern. There is a movement, pretty much influenced by the French Revolution, to have a separation of church and state. Again, you know in our own society in the U.S. that this concept, much debated, but very, very well known, is something that is influencing countries back in Europe. And in the French Revolution, this was one of the aspects as well, to separate church from state. In the 1840s, Catholic publications in Germany opposed revolutionary activities that were designed to define nation states. Nation states that challenged traditional monarchies, nation states that challenged traditional roles of the church. So we start to see some Catholic newspapers, Catholic publications that come out very strongly against these revolutionary activities. And when the church comes out against these revolutionary activities, some of these revolutionary calls are also a lot about patriotism, right? My country first. And so you're going to find that some people will start to view the church as somehow not patriotic. Right? The same publications argued that Catholicism and Christianity were necessary for a healthy society, for a healthy state. So the church involved in publications against certain revolutionary activities are then going to start to make the claim that in order to define what a state is in this revolutionary time, means that it must include Catholicism, it must include Christianity to indeed be a healthy state. A lot of the political activities of the 19th century and the political activities of the church in publications, in activities associated with the sacrament of marriage, with education. A lot of the political activities of the 19th century and some of these political activities of the church are going to start to politicize Catholicism itself. Right? This, as we said earlier, this idea that perhaps if you are not for the revolution, for freedom, for liberalism, what it means to be free, then you're maybe not a good patriot. Right? So these kinds of things began to start to happen. In 1866, we'll see the Austro-Prussian War. And this is the war between Austria and Prussia as these regions in Germany are trying to decide how do we become a state, whom will we support. Then there's also, in 1870, another war between France and Prussia. The church sided against Prussia in both of these wars. The church sided with Austria, which is heavily Catholic. The church sided with France, which is also heavily Catholic, against Prussia. And the people in Germany saw this then as the church sort of taking sides in warfare against Germans themselves, right? So, as you can see, this is going to lead to some political issues. The liberal majorities in Germany and in Prussia began to regard the church as backward, began to regard the church as filled with the enemies of progress, as we saw in that cartoon. And they even claimed that monastic life, which had grown in the 19th century as the church supported more and more religious activities, religious approaches to living and life. They claimed monastic life was the epitome of the backward Catholic medievalism. So, lots of popular feeling, political feeling against the church as Germany begins to unify. There's a dramatic rise in the 19th century in the number of monasteries, convents, clerical religious groups. So even as some of these feelings are starting to be made known, it's pretty clear to various communities, various areas, that there are more monasteries, more convents, more religious groups around them. The Diocese of Cologne, for example, saw a tenfold increase in the number of monks and nuns between 1850 and 1872. Wow. So there's no doubting that religious life is popular. Religious spirituality is on the rise. The church has been engaged in sort of trying to combat some of these ideas of the Enlightenment, suggesting you don't need a church for a moral center. You don't need the church to help you design good laws, right? And so what we see instead is that the church is being very successful in engaging in publications, in engaging in different approaches to associations, and clearly religious orders. So they're actually enjoying quite a boon in Germany in the 19th century. As we move forward and we see German unification, and this map gives you some indication, right? We see that as Germany comes together and forms its own state, and this map shows what Germany looked like on the verge of unification. You see all these different places, all these different entities, really. Prussia over here, as we were saying earlier, and Saxony, Bavaria, etc. So it's a very diverse area. About 25 million people living in this region are Protestant, about 15 million Catholic. So about a third Catholic, about two-thirds Protestant. Although a minority in the empire, Catholics were the majority in certain states, right? So you see these states listed: Bavaria, Baden, Alsace, Lorraine, West Prussia, Posen, the Rhineland, Westphalia, etc. So when you see Westphalia, the Rhineland, we also have Baden, Bavaria. So while they might be the minority, if you will, into the whole of the region, in many of the local communities, they are the majority. This map is just to give you just one more representation of Catholic versus Protestant. If you are interested in this map, of course you can slow down this video if you like and see how this is the side for Catholic, this is the side for Protestant, and when you look at these different locations, it'll show you the breakdown. So the darker green is a heavier concentration of Catholics. The lighter sort of tan is a heavier concentration of Protestants. It tended to be that if your community was Catholic, it tended to stay Catholic. If your community was Protestant, it tended to stay that way. As I was noting, the population in Germany was generally segregated along religious lines, rural areas. Towns were overwhelmingly, if not entirely, the same religion. So it was unusual to have a Protestant next door neighbor if you were Catholic. It was unusual to have the farmer next door be Catholic if you were Protestant. Education was also separate and usually in the hands of the churches. There was little mutual tolerance, we understand, interaction or intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants. So as we're unifying Germany, you can see that there are some significant lines, religious lines, cultural lines being drawn. And then finally, Protestants in general were deeply distrustful of the Catholic Church. Again, we think of the Renaissance and the Reformation as a time of challenging traditional authority, and the Church is indeed that traditional authority that Protestants challenged. We have a cartoon coming, and in this cartoon, the Chancellor tries to pull a rope attached to St. Peter's Basilica and declares to Satan that he intends to destroy the papacy. Satan replies, "I've been trying to do that all my life. If you manage it, I shall give you full marks." So the Chancellor is the Chancellor of Germany. This is Otto von Bismarck, and he's trying to pull the strings, if you will. And we'll take a look. So what we have here is Wilhelm I in the foreground. Here's the Pope, of course, and Wilhelm doing a very high-stepping entrance, and here is Bismarck sort of behind the curtains trying to manage all of this. And so the idea is, how can we live, modus vivendi, how can we find a way to live with the new German state and the papacy? The thing that follows is the Kulturkampf, this culture clash. And the following examples I have come from a work called Catholic Answers, and it's an article called The Faithful Under Siege in Germany. So this is from the Catholic perspective. But I think we oftentimes, when we look at science and society and science and religion, we oftentimes look at it from the perspective of science. And we have plenty of examples of that. So that's one reason I wanted to present this from the perspective of the Church. Not that I'm particularly advocating one side or another. I'm trying to understand the relationship between science and religion in the 19th century as we move into what we are calling the modern era. In 1871, we find that there's a new law in Germany, and this law prescribes 2 years in prison for any clergyman who addresses a political topic in the pulpit. All right, that's significant. And also in 1871, we're going to find that the Roman Catholic Department for Religious Affairs in the Prussian government was closed for being so-called pro-Polish. Poland being the next neighbor over to the east from Germany. So the Roman Catholic Department for Religious Affairs in the Prussian government was closed in 1871. Now, that reminds us that there is indeed a Roman Catholic Department for Religious Affairs in the government, right? So we are working at a time period where that understanding of separation of church and state, you cannot take for granted. We're actually kind of creating that in Germany. In 1872, all religious schools were required to accept official government inspections, right? So that means that they're going to come in and see what these teachers are teaching in religion-supported schools. 1872, all religious teachers were removed from government schools. So now we have government schools in Germany, and if you are teaching religion, or you are yourself a priest or a nun who's just teaching in the school, you will be removed. This is very fast, right? So, prison terms for clergymen who address political topics in the pulpit, Roman Catholic departments being closed, religious schools required to accept government inspections, religious teachers removed from government schools, and in 1872 the German government broke off all diplomatic relations with the Holy See, all diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Very, very fast, within 1 year of unification. 1873, all seminarians, both Catholic and Protestant, had to study at state-controlled high schools and universities where they had to pass an examination in German culture, including German history, philosophy, and literature. That seems very strange to us, that all seminarians in Germany, regardless of whether or not they were going to go off to teach in schools, right? All seminarians, both Catholic and Protestant, have to study in state-controlled schools, and they have to pass an examination on German culture, history, philosophy, and literature. We are teaching people how to be good Germans, and we want our clergy to be good Germans. All priests and clergy have to meet state approval before they can be appointed to any positions. If the church installed an unapproved priest or bishop, the offending cleric was removed and charged with a civil crime. So now the state is not only determining what kind of education a seminarian ought to have, but also determining whether or not that seminarian is acceptable for a church position. 1875, all church property was confiscated, and over 200 priests were arrested, along with over 130 newspaper editors. 5 bishops in Prussia were deposed, and 1,000 parishes were stripped of their priests. So as you can see, the church is putting up some kind of resistance, right, to the state encroaching upon her affairs. And finally, the state, in 1875, brings down the hammer, confiscates all church property, arrests priests, shuts down newspapers, deposes bishops, and removes 1,000 priests from parishes. This is the Kulturkampf. This is the clash, the culture war. Let me just back up quick. This is when, if you know the founding of our university, this is when the sisters who founded our university had to leave Germany. They found that they could no longer teach, they could no longer be nurses, they could no longer be professionals as Catholics, and they had to leave. They had to come to, so many of them came to America, and some of the sisters who founded our school came here from Germany. So we're moving forward a little bit. I wanted to show how the significant changes in the 19th century with regard to the faithful, both Protestant and Catholic, certainly had a lot to do with science. But it seems to me the historical, the political, the social context, how these churches are operating, particularly in Italy and Germany, which were our 2 test cases, show that it's not just science that's got them reeling, right? But it's technology, it's the Industrial Revolution, it's the Enlightenment, it's these various attempts at revolutionary living with regard to the development of France, the developments in Italy and in Germany to create nation states, where we are really pushing for a separation of church and state. Right? So there's a lot going on that they're dealing with. So let's move to the 20th century and try to make a few conclusions here. Today, I would tell you that the Catholic Church in particular is seen by some as the largest and longest term patron of science and medicine. It's true. You can look this up. There are institutions within the Vatican, there are grants that the Vatican gives, but then there's also the church as a whole through things like Catholic Charities, the Via Christi hospital system, right? That's just the tip of the iceberg in our little community here in Wichita. But you can see the reach, the influence of the church, its role in healthcare, its role in education, its role in university life. It is a huge patron of science and medicine. For the first 100 years or so of Darwin, when Darwin published his Descent of Man, the church took no formal stance on Darwinism. They actually waited a while on Copernicanism, right? So the church takes the long view. The church takes the long-term view on these issues. The Pontifical Academy of Science, one of the impressive institutions supported by the Vatican, this is Pope Benedict the 16th in the New York Times 2007, scientific research must be encouraged, must be promoted, so long as it does not harm other human beings. So long as it does not harm other human beings whose dignity is inviolable from the very first stages of existence. So scientific research must be encouraged and promoted, but there are limits, according to the Church. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences held a workshop on stem cell research in 2012. The event focused on the potential of induced pluripotent stem cells, which have the ability to develop into different cell types, but don't have to come from embryos. right? So embryonic stem cell research, not acceptable in the Pontifical Academy of Sciences because it harms other human beings whose dignity is inviolable from the very first stages of existence, right? So the Pontifical Academy of Science can get behind stem cell research, but just not embryonic. John Paul II and the Church at the end of the 20th century showed general acceptance of theistic evolution, which states that God created a universe where cosmic and biological evolution occurred. So the Church, willing to accept elements of Darwin's evolutionary theory, right, and demonstrating that theistic evolution reconciles the concept of a God-created universe where cosmic and biological evolution occur. We also have now in the 21st century Pope Francis weighing in on issues of consumerism, rapid technological development, environmental degradation, global warming in his Laudato Si'. This came out just last summer, just a year ago. You have the whole thing referenced at Blackboard. If you are thinking of working on an issue along these lines for your final paper, do take a look at it. Do take a look at selections from it. We'll tackle a few of those here in this video. Science and religion, Francis says, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into an intense dialogue, fruitful for both. Religions, including Christianity, can make rich contributions towards an integral ecology and the full development of humanity. So Pope Francis sees both faith and religion working together. Faith and science working together. Catholicism and science, Christianity and science working together to try to come to conclusions, to try to solve problems that we face in the world today. On technology, he argues the technological paradigm has become so dominant in our society that it would be difficult to do without its resources, and even more difficult to utilize them without being dominated by their internal logic. Interesting, right? Now we're getting into sort of what's the influence of science and technology upon us, and what's the influence of science and technology in particular, on the way we think and the way we process and the way we approach each other and the world. The technological paradigm has become so dominant that it would be difficult to do without its resources, and even more difficult to utilize them without being dominated by their internal logic. Interesting to think about, right? Technology, it has become countercultural to choose a lifestyle whose goals are even partly independent of technology. It has become countercultural to choose a lifestyle whose goals are even partly independent of technology. That's interesting to me, counterculture, to be against the culture, right? So that even the church knows it can't be countercultural. Francis has entered Twitter, he's entered Instagram, he's entered all of the social media. I'll be honest with you, I'm pretty famous for not carrying a cell phone. And I don't carry a cell phone. My kids hate it. But I have to tell you, I now have friends who envy me because I went to Europe for 10 days and didn't take a phone. And they think that's kind of cool, right? But I'm weird. And I'm the last person, I think they thought, who would ever teach an online course because of that. Technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic. And those who are surrounded with technology know full well that it moves forward in the final analysis neither for profit nor for the well-being of the human race. Technology tends to absorb everything in its ironclad logic. And those who are surrounded with technology know full well that it moves forward in the final analysis neither for profit of the human race nor for the well-being of the human race. But that's kind of pessimistic. We've been talking about how GMOs may indeed feed the world. Will things like GMOs be for the profit or the well-being of the human race? Or will they be for the profit and the well-being of the companies that produce them? Pope Francis suggests that the environmental crisis that we're engaged in now can ultimately only be solved if our immense technological developments are accompanied by, quote, a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. The environmental crisis can ultimately only be solved if our immense technological developments are accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. This is what we expect our faith to do for us, right? We expect our faith to give us that moral center, that moral value, that sense of human responsibility.